Well, good morning, everyone. Um, my name is Mr. Mann, in case you don't know me, and I'll be teaching biology this year. And I can't be there in person on our first day because I will be still in Alaska, and I will be heading back on Wednesday. Um, so that's why I'm not there, and I'll be. We'll do our Zoom meeting on Friday, where I will review this lesson. But we wanted to get you started through a video, and hopefully this will help you guys out, at least getting started. So what we're going to do is, according to the syllabus, we're going to start with the first uh, lesson, that is cytology, the design and function of cells. And then, it's out of order from the book. You don't really need to have the book, but the book is nice to have to look at pictures, illustrations, and things like that. If you don't have it, you can do just fine. I provide all the notes every week, so we're going to follow, of course, the syllabus, and not necessarily any order from the book. And in fact, like I said, you don't even have to have the book. It's just a nice addition to have. If you got it, it can help you if you want to look at pictures, perhaps. But anyhow, we'll start with cytology, and like I said, we'll review it on Friday. Okay. So let's go ahead and dive in. There's three main parts to a cell. Okay, and that would be the nucleus. You can look at your notes that you should have printed prior to class. I'm going to be reading off of these notes. So there's three main parts. There's the nucleus, the cytoplasm, and the cell membrane. The nucleus contains the DNA, which is really, really important. I'm sure you've heard of DNA before. It's basically the master control center for the cell. And then there's the cytoplasm, which makes up the bulk of the cell. It's where it's fluid filled, and it's where all the organelles, but think of it as like organs of the cell. They're called organelles, and they are found within the cytoplasm, and all the different organelles have different functions, and you're going to learn about those. And then the third part of the cell is the cell membrane. It's also called a plasma membrane, and it separates the cell from other cells, and it controls what leaves and what enters the cell. So it's a boundary. It's like a fence. Okay, so it keeps us separate from other cells. It marks a boundary from one cell to another cell. And like I said, it allows certain things in and allows certain things out, and it prevents other things from coming in and out. So that's the cell membrane or plasma membrane. Those are the three main parts of the cell. So let's look at each part a little bit more in detail. We have the nucleus. The nucleus is separated by the cytoplasm by a nuclear membrane, or a nuclear envelope is what it's called. There are little pores in this nuclear envelope that bounds the nucleus. These little pores allow things to move in and out of the nucleus as needed. You'll learn a little bit more about that in the future. But it's basically these little pores allow things to be transported, molecules and whatnot, to be transported into and out of the nucleus. Again, the nucleus contains the DNA. It's the master control center, and the DNA, of course, is the blueprint for everything that goes on in the cell. Inside the nucleus, this DNA is coiled to make room for, it has to be tightly wound up and coiled so that there's enough room in the nucleus to house all the chromosomes or DNA. Chromosomes is nothing but DNA. It's another word for DNA that's found within the nucleus. Let's see here. This coiled state interwoven within the nucleus is interwoven with this material called nuclear matrix, which basically is what fills up the nucleus outside of the DNA that the DNA is found within. It's called the nuclear matrix. The nucleus is also found with the nucleus, and it manufactures the ribosomes. Ribosomes are an organelle, and you'll find them mostly in the cytoplasm, but there are a thing called a nucleus within the nucleus that manufactures these ribosomes. Ribosomes, of course, an organelle, which is also known as the protein factory. Proteins are made from ribosomes, and you're going to learn about that in the near future. Okay, ultimately, proteins are made within the cytoplasm, but it starts with the DNA, and you're going to learn that in the near future. So moving from the nucleus to the cytoplasm, this is, like I said, the bulk of the cell. It is a fluid medium that is stuff moves around in. These organelles, for the most part, are found here. Most of the activities of life occur within the cytoplasm. Carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins. Enzymes are an example of a protein, and we have lots of enzymes that run chemical reactions within our body. But carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, which all can be, of course, taken in by our diet as well. These are found here, and they are used to manufacture energy within the cell by a specific organelle that you're going to learn about in a minute. Found within the cytoplasm is the cytoskeleton. It's made up of microtubules, so small little tubes, to give the cell its shape and maintain its shape. So it has kind of a skeleton called a cytoskeleton, and it's made up of these small little tubes that crisscross and go all around in the cytoplasm, and it gives it structure. So it allows the cell to not just be a blob moving around and forming all kinds of different shapes. It maintains a constant shape from the cytoskeleton. The microtubules act as the gates to and from the cell for transporting stuff in and out by packaging it in vesicles. So a lot of times when the cell is shipping something out of the cell, let's say into the bloodstream, it'll package the material that it wants to ship out into a vesicule, and that's the name of this little package that's then transported out of the cell, out of the cytoplasm, through the plasma membrane, and out into, let's say, the bloodstream, for instance. Okay, so as we just mentioned a bunch of different kind of functions. We talked about energy production. We talked about shipping something out. These are all different functions that occur within a cell, and we have specific organelles that are found in the cytoplasm that are responsible for those functions, and each one has its own responsibility. So it's kind of like, you know, you can think of your organs that you have in your body. We have the heart. The heart is responsible for pumping blood, right? So we have different organelles within the cell that has its own function, and we're gonna look at each one of those. The first one we want to look at is the mitochondria. Okay, the mitochondria is an organelle. It's also known as the power plant of the cell. The reason it's known as the power plant is because it is responsible for manufacturing energy for the cell so that it can do what it needs to do. If on a landscape level and on our bodies, all the cells within our body producing energy, that's what allows me to talk. It allows us to walk, run, eat. All the different activities we do is these energies provided by this organelle called mitochondria. It is sausage shaped in the way it looks. I'm going to go ahead and get my little board here. I'm going to draw a picture. Get it a little closer to you. Okay, so I'm going to draw a picture of it, but the mitochondria kind of looks like sausage shaped, and it's made up of two different layers. Okay, it's got an inner layer and an outer layer. So again, sausage shaped, has an inner and outer layer. It produces energy by using carbohydrates. One of the major carbohydrates that the body uses is sugars. So when you eat, and I'm not talking about candy or something like that, I'm talking about like sugars that are found in like bread. If you eat a piece of bread, there's a lot of sugar, known as the carbohydrates that are found in there, and that is used to produce energy. Another thing is fats, also known as lipids. They can be used to manufacture energy. The mitochondria uses those raw materials to make energy. Again, it contains an outer and an inner membrane. The inner membrane is folded to increase surface area. If this was just a circle on the inner part, you would have a lot less marker needed to draw it, right? That's because drawing it this way takes a lot more time and takes more marker use to get that drawing. That's increasing surface area, and that's important for it to be able to maximize its energy production. The little note I have in my notes is that it also is the opposite of photosynthesis. You're going to learn as time goes on, what we do in our bodies to produce energy is basically the opposite of what plants are doing. Plants take energy in from the sun to produce a sugar. And then, of course, we eat that sugar. We eat plants. And then we use that sugar to make energy. So it's the flip-flop. Plants use energy from the sun to make sugar. We take sugar and make energy. So photosynthesis is the opposite of what we do in making energy. They use energy to make something. We use what they make to make energy. So it's kind of like I always talk about the circle of life with the animal kingdom. Plants and animals, how they interact with each other to complete the circle of life. And we'll talk about that in the future. But it's just a little side note. What we do to make energy, plants do the opposite. Okay, let's move on to the second organelle. Ribosomes. Okay, ribosomes, we mentioned these earlier when we talked about the nucleus. Ribosomes are the protein factories. So mitochondria was the power plant to make energy. Ribosomes are the protein factories. They make proteins, okay? They are clam-like structures. So they're shaped, this was the mitochondria. And then a ribosome, that's still on the screen. A ribosome is kind of clam-shaped. So it looks almost like two shells coming together. Okay, that's the shape of it. Let's see. They produce proteins, also known as enzymes, in our body. Enzymes are used to facilitate chemical reactions that occurs within all our cells of our body. Enzymes are catalysts, meaning they speed up the reaction so that we can do things quickly. All right. Proteins ultimately, like I said earlier, are made from copies of the DNA. DNA have a code, and that code is used to make these proteins. And that's how the body knows how to make them. And we're going to learn about that in the near future. Okay, moving on to the third organelle that I want you to know inside the cell, and that is the endoplasmic reticulum. There's two types of endoplasmic reticulum, abbreviated as ER. The first is called smooth ER, and the other one is called rough ER. The difference is smooth ER doesn't have any rough ribosomes attached to it, which would make it look rough. If it's rough ER, it has ribosomes attached to it, so it's studded with ribosomes, and that's what gives it its rough appearance. So ER that has no ribosomes is called smooth ER, and endoplasmic reticulum that has studded ribosomes on it make it rough looking. It's called rough ER. Basically, the endoplasmic reticulum is kind of like the highway system of a cell. Things are able to be moved around from one end of the cell to the other cell, from the nucleus to other parts of the cell, through using the endoplasmic reticulum, almost like I said, highways, or I often imagine like a slide. If you were jumped on top of a slide to slide down into a pool, that's what endoplasmic reticulum is, kind of like a slide from one place to another. So I'll draw a picture here. Smooth ER, would look like this, kind of like a highway or a slide moving from one end of the cell to another end. The rough ER, of course, is studded with ribosomes, and it gives it a real rough appearance. But basically it has the same function in that things are able to move easily from one place to another within the cell using the endoplasmic reticulum. Now let's move on to the fourth organelle. The fourth organelle is called the Golgi complex. The Golgi complex is the shipping center of the cell. So I often tell people it's like the UPS or the United States Postal Service or the FedEx of the cell. It's responsible for taking things, packaging it up into vesicles, little packages that are to be shipped into or out of the cell. That's what the Golgi complex does. So think of the Golgi complex as the FedEx of the cell. Okay. Let me flip the page on my notes. Okay. The next organelle is a lysosome. A lysosome are vesicles. Okay, lysosomes are vesicles that are filled with an acid, and they recycle proteins and attack bacteria that invade the cell. So lysosomes kind of roam around within the cell. It's an organelle that roams around and is looking to get rid of stuff that doesn't need to be there anymore. Either old proteins that are no longer usable, and maybe even foreign things like a bacteria or a virus to kill it. And it has, it's fluid filled with acid, and it basically, acid digests anything it needs to be digested. And then, of course, the material is taken to the last organelle that I wanted to teach you about, and that's a vacuole. Look at the vacuoles as basically the garbage can of the cell. It stores materials. And so anything that has been swept up by a lysosome, for instance, it can be deposited temporarily in a vacuole, and then eventually it can be emptied out of the cell by the Golgi complex. So vacuoles are nothing but storage containers of the cell, or the garbage can of the cell. Now in plants, vacuoles tend to be really, really big, because all that food that plants make from the energy provided by the sun and the water that's provided by the soil, and the nutrients that are provided by the soil, all that is made into sugar, and it needs to be stored somewhere within the plant cell. Vacuoles tend to be very large in plants because that's where all that sugar is stored. So it's not necessarily a garbage can in a plant cell. It's actually more like a kitchen pantry, okay, for a plant, because it's storing good stuff. Where in animal cells like that are in you and me, that's more like a garbage can. It's storing stuff that eventually needs to get out of the cell, and it's not very useful. So plants have vacuoles, plant cells have vacuoles, just like animal cells have vacuoles, but they're storing different things. One is good, like in plants, storing sugar, and animal cells tend to store garbage, things that need to get rid of. And so that's why I call them garbage cans of the cell. And I want to make that point that that's really just in animal cells. And plant cells that are not really garbage cans, the vacuoles are more like kitchen pantry, storing food. Okay, moving on from the one thing I did, it's hard to do here, but in class I always draw a picture of a cell. And I hope you can see that, but the picture of the cell, we have the nucleus. Okay, and it's bound by the nuclear membrane or envelope. Okay, here's the cell membrane that bounds the cell. Of course, also called plasma. Just another word. Biologists love to have multiple words for the same thing. So plasma membrane or cell membrane, same thing. Nuclear membrane or nuclear envelope, same thing. Nucleus, of course, contains all the DNA. Okay, it's held within the nucleus and protected there. This is the cytoplasm. This is the fluid filled part of the cell that contains all the organelles. So here's my mitochondria. Here's a lysosome. This is my endoplasmic reticulum. We'll make it rough ER, studded with ribosomes. We have a Golgi complex. A Golgi complex, I didn't mention this, but a Golgi complex looks like a stack of pancakes. Okay, it's looks like it's a membrane that are folded upon itself. It looks like I said, a stack of pancakes. That's a Golgi complex. That's for shipping, of course. Power plant is the mitochondria. Lysosome is to get rid of stuff that needs to be get rid of. Vacuole, I didn't draw a vacuole. We'll draw that right here. The garbage bin in an animal cell. What else did I miss? Mitochondria. I'm sorry, ribosome. A clam-shaped protein factory. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and that looks like that covers them all. Those are the 6 main organelles that are found within the cell. There's pictures in your book if you have a book, or you can get on the internet, look at pictures if you want to. There's things that are probably I didn't mention, and you don't need to know all that. Only thing you need to know is what I talk about. So if I drew it or I mentioned it and I discussed it, it's in your notes. That is fair game for a quiz or an exam. If you happen to look on the internet to look at some pictures of what cells look like, animal cells, and you see some other things that I never mentioned, do not worry about it. I'm not requiring you to know things that other people talk about. Only what I talk about. Okay? So keep that in mind if you look outside at outside sources. Okay, so let's see here. Let's move on to the cell membrane, or plasma membrane specifically. Okay? I'm going to lean this. Let's see, I'll lean this right here for the time being. And then we'll go back because I'm going to want to draw a picture of the plasma membrane. Okay, so cell membrane. It's also known as a plasma membrane, and all the substances that go in and out of the cell goes through this membrane. Again, it keeps the structure of what the cell looks like separate from other cells, and again is the gateway for things going in and out. The membrane is made up of phospholipids. That's just a fancy term for saying it's made up of fatty acids with a phosphorus attached to it. No, so we call them phospholipids because lipid means fat. And there's 2 layers of phospholipids, and so we call the membrane a lipid bilayer. Lipid meaning fat, bi meaning 2, layer, 2 layers. So there's 2 layers of these phospholipids, and that make up the cell membrane or plasma membrane, and we call it a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, or lipid bilayer. The reason why it's set up this way is because one end of the lipid bilayer is one side of it, the inside part is hydrophobic, and then the outside part is hydrophilic. And that's important because as things move in and out of the cell membrane is able to, it gets distorted as things move in and out, and so it has to be able to repair itself and restore itself back to its original look. And in order to do that, it uses its hydrophobic and hydrophilic ends to orient properly. Okay? So the one, like I said, the one layer, the one side of it's called hydrophobic, meaning it's afraid of water, so it wants to avoid water, and it will always orient itself away from water molecules. And the other end is hydrophilic, and that means it loves water. Hydro meaning water, and philic meaning love. Of course, the other word hydrophobic, hydro meaning water, phobic meaning fear. So the hydrophobic, afraid of water, hydrophilic, loves water. So if you're a hydrophilic end of the lipid bilayer, you're always trying to get to the water. You love water, so you want to be oriented close to it. If you're hydrophobic, you want to get away from it. So it's able to reorient itself once it gets disturbed in a way that part of it's getting away from the water and part of it's getting towards the water, and then it always ends up in the same position in the end. Okay, so let me draw a picture of that phospholipid bilayer that I've been talking about, and see if you can follow that a little bit better. Okay, with a drawing. So this is the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the cell membrane. Okay, we have just bear with me while I draw this. I'll draw 4, and then on this side, the other layer. Okay, so you probably can see that. Okay, so this is the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, 2 layers. Here's one, 2 layers. These are hydrophobic, and these are hydrophilic. Okay, so these tails are fatty acids. There's 2 of them, okay, and they're hydrophilic. They love water. So they're always going to, I'm sorry, I got it flipped. I'm sorry. Hydrophilic is the outside, hydrophobic is the inside, okay? My bad. So we have these fatty acid tails, and then we have this round head, okay? The round head is hydrophilic, loves water. The tails are hydrophobic. They hate water. They got to get away from it. So that's one layer. Here's the other layer, making the phospholipid bilayer. So if something passes through, let's say I'm a vesicule, and I'm passing through the bilipid layer to get to the outside. When I pass through, I'm going to mess up a part of the cell membrane as I bulldoze my way through. And it's going to be distorted, this phospholipid bilayer. And how does it know to get back to the way it looked before something bulldozed through it? The heads, which are hydrophilic, are always going to face out. So let's say these get flipped around as this bulldozes through. It'll reorient itself after the passing of the vesicule. The heads will realign to the outside because it's hydrophilic, seeking water. And the tails are going to be oriented inside to each other, trying to hide away from the water because it's hydrophobic. So no matter how I screw up this, bulldozing through this part of the layer and this part of the layer, this bilayer, these will always then come back together, oriented correctly, because of these hydrophilic and hydrophobic ends. And that's how it's able to restore itself after it was distorted from something moving through it. So that's the phospholipid bilayer that makes up the plasma membrane, also known as the cell membrane. Okay? I hope that helps, and we can, if that confuses you in any way, we can talk about it again on Friday when we're over Zoom. But you'll be able to ask me questions, and I can hopefully help you understand that. Okay, so that's why that phospholipid bilayer is so important, to have that so that it's very flexible. It can be distorted as something passes through it, and then it can restore itself once the object passes through because of these hydrophobic and hydrophilic principles that make up the phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so moving on, if you go back to the notes, it says the membrane is made up of phospholipids. Okay, we talked about that. A lipid bilayer, hydrophobic, hydrophilic. Okay, the last sentence in that first paragraph says, thus they are able to keep a certain form as they orient to water surrounding them. Actin, the last sentence, actin and spectrin help support and strengthen the cell membrane. Okay, so there's some other things found within the membrane. I didn't draw them. And I don't even mention them here. There's proteins that are found within the cell membrane that help move things in and out. So something doesn't necessarily have to bulldoze through the phospholipid bilayer, but it can go through what they call a transport protein, a protein that's embedded within the phospholipid bilayer that is like a gateway for something big to move through. And we have other things like these proteins called actin and spectrin that are found laced within the phospholipid bilayer that gives it strength and rigidity, so that it gives it some ability to maintain itself. Okay, it doesn't just go flip-flopping all around. This actin and spectrin helps support the cell membrane. Okay, moving on to the second paragraph of my notes. The cell membrane transports products in and out of the cells to do work so the body can function. The cell membrane also helps in maintaining homeostasis. What's homeostasis? This is a stable internal environment. Homeo means same, okay? Stasis means, a balance. So you want the same thing. Your cells don't, want, for instance, the amount of water within the cell. There's a certain amount that needs to be there. The amount of other material needs to be stayed, let's say outside of the cell. It maintains the proper concentrations of things within the cell and outside of the cell. The cell membrane then allows things in and out as needed, so it's maintaining homeostasis. That's all I'm trying to say there. A balance, a proper balance. And if it gets out of whack, the cell can get into trouble. For instance, if there's too much water in the cell can actually explode. Too much water coming in. So that's not maintaining a homeostasis. If there's not enough water in the cell, it can shrink up and die because it shrinks up too much. And that's not maintaining homeostasis. So that what's going in and out of the cell is done to maintain a balance called homeostasis. Now, this movement of stuff into and out of the cell, there's different methods at how things move, okay? One is called diffusion. One method of movement. So if something moves from one part, let's say outside the cell to the inside of the cell, it can move by diffusion. And what that means is there's no energy required for it to move. It just moves naturally. And the way it moves naturally is diffusion always means something is moving from a higher concentration to a lower concentration. So let's say your cell doesn't have enough salt in it, but there's a lot of salt outside of the cell. The salt can diffuse into the cell from a higher concentration outside the cell to a lesser concentration inside the cell. It can move by diffusion, not using any energy to make the movement until a homeostasis is achieved, where the proper amount of salt is in the cell and outside the cell. Okay, that's diffusion, the movement of something. Excuse me, the movement of some material from a higher concentration to a lesser concentration to get to a balance, a homeostasis, and it doesn't require energy to make the movement. That is one form of movement. It's called diffusion. Another form of movement is called active transport. Active transport is the movement of something using energy to move it from one place to another. And it doesn't necessarily need to follow from a higher concentration to a lesser concentration. In fact, a lot of the times,